This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. Before we get to our guest this episode, Andy Bochman, I want to give one last plug for the S4x23 call for presentations. This, I believe, will come out on August 16th. Today is August 14th when we're recording. And right now I have accepted 27 sessions. That's about half. We put on about 50 sessions on stage. We have maybe 50 or 60 maybes. So we have plenty of content, but we're looking for those amazing, great sessions that are new and important to early adopters and pioneers. So the kind of the leading 5% in ICS security. So if you have something and you want to get up on stage and share it and help us create the future, you go to s4xevents.com/CFP. For those of you watching the video, you'll see it on the screen. For those of you listening, take a look in the show notes. And you can just send an email. If you want to, if it's easier for you, send an email to s4@digitalbond.com. I've given a lot of advice as to what to do and what not to do. I guess I'd say don't overthink it. Keep it short. Focus on what's new and important. Avoid paragraph after paragraph setting the scene, which is what I usually get. So really just tell me what's new and important. And I look forward to getting and seeing your great work and putting it on stage. And with that quick CFP, Liz, let's bring Andy on board. My guest this episode is a returning guest, actually, Andy Bochman. He is a senior grid strategist at Idaho National Labs. He is the co-author, along with Sarah Freeman, of the book Countering Cyber Sabotage, which really was a kind of a primer on CCE, consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering. So you might know the CCE term more than the title of the book. But if you're interested in CCE, Sarah and Andy's book is the one to read. And the reason for this, having you back on the show, Andy, is you submitted a talk for S4x23 called OT Security, Cyber and Climate Nexus. And it was very intriguing. I will say, when it came in, I said, "Ooh, this is an interesting idea. I want to find out about this Nexus." I watched your talk 2 times now, and I'm an analyst, and I still can't figure out what I think about it. I can't figure out, is there a Nexus? Is there not a Nexus? What is that Nexus? So I thought I'd have you on the show to maybe explore some of those questions some more. So welcome back to the show again, Andy.
Thanks, Dale. And it seems like you're willing to put yourself through some significant punishment to answer this question and figure out which way you really think about this so-called Nexus.
Well, I think if you, I guess, excuse me a little bit to talk just a touch more about S4.
Please.
One of the things that we try to do is put a lot of ideas in front of people. And they're not ideas necessarily that I think are right or wrong. I put some ideas that I think are wrong. That's not the case here. This is an undecided for me. But we like to throw a lot of ideas at people. And I think this is an interesting idea. There are 2 massive topics: cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and climate change in general and how it's affecting critical infrastructure. What was, maybe as a starting point, what was the origin of your thinking there might be some nexus between these 2?
I think this is like from a Seinfeld episode where they talk about worlds colliding. And in that episode, you try to keep your worlds from colliding. It causes awkwardness. In my experience, I've always been somewhat environmental person since being raised as a kid on nature shows. Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, I think, is one that was the first one, maybe. But my career has always been one that's taken me far afield from environmental issues, mainly meaning I started off in the military. I ended up working in cybersecurity spaces, working with utilities in the tech space. And I was really, except for moonlighting and doing my own reading at night, I was pretty far from anything environmental. I did go and get a master's in biology and environmental management degree at Harvard Night School when I was in the Air Force as a lieutenant. serving not too far from Cambridge, Massachusetts at Hanscom Air Force Base. But still, there was no way to sort of follow that leaning into my day job. In 2018, at a conference, and I think this is a reprise from the S4 talk, I was invited to interview the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States at a conference in Park City. And it was, of course, we were going to talk about the 2015 and 2016 cyber attacks that affected distribution and then transmission assets, respectively. And that interview went fine. It was, I think, good for him, good for me, and good for the audience. It was in a side conversation down a hallway. A gentleman was preparing his remarks who was going to go on after me. And I had seen him. I thought he was familiar to me. He was a videographer, and he'd made a movie that had come out, say, half a dozen years prior called Chasing Ice. His name's Jim Baylog. He lives in Boulder, Colorado, and he was there to do a world premiere of his next film called The Human Element. Basically, both of these films are designed to using stories and obviously videos to help folks who just wholly unacquainted with the fact that things on Earth are changing, that since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, emissions of carbon, methane, and other things have made the temperatures of the atmosphere go up. It made temperatures of the ocean go up. The ocean, by the way, captures, I think, 90% of the additional temperature so far, without which people say the air temperature would be so much higher. Anyway, talks with him, like in real life, and with some of the other folks there who were ocean people, had me saying to myself, okay, you're defending the grid, you're defending the other interdependent infrastructures against cyber attack. I don't know if many of my colleagues see this other vector, but it seems to have tremendous potential to wreak havoc on the things they care about. And all of us together are trying to protect civilization, modern civilization. So I'm going to start putting stuff in my head, paying attention to it. And who knows, maybe at some point in the not too distant future, there'll be enough in there that I can be helpful, whether it's from the national lab perspective at INL or via other means.
It's funny, when you started your talk at S4, you actually followed instructions, which I appreciate.
Instructions, you're excellent.
I say I'll always start out strong. And you had this, I'm going to read a quote from almost at the start of your session. It says, "What you know about protecting critical infrastructure from cyber threats is potentially valuable and quite useful in the future for protecting those same infrastructure elements that we care about from what's coming at us from climate." Can you maybe, I thought that framed the issue real well, but can you give us maybe an example or two of how what we know about protecting critical infrastructure from cyber attacks could help protect critical infrastructure from climate?
Yeah, sure. Before I do, give me 30 seconds to do a plug for S4. And this experience, as Dale said, I followed instructions. Those are his instructions. And he provides I'll say you, second person, provide really exquisite guidance on how to optimize your talk. For folks that have some experience, helps them fine tune it. And I think some of the people, because you encourage it, are brand new on stage. And it gives them some structure to work with, where otherwise they might be completely at sea. Obviously, it's for them and it's for the audience too, so they get a higher quality presentation. I really appreciated it and recommend the experience to others. In terms of what the heck was I talking about? How can those folks out in the S4 OT security world, how can this apply to them? How can what they know, and I think it says know how to do, apply in the future on climate issues? I was thinking as we were building the Venn diagram we can mention, I'll start at the basis level. Part of it is it's what you're doing. Hopefully it's what you were born to do, to be a defender. And while you need to be very specific if you're going to be of use and focus on one topic area so you can have depth, in this case, OT cyber, which we all know is not a monolith, that there are a number of different subtopics you need to go deep in if you're going to be helpful for, and not just a total generalist. But I was thinking about, so first of all, the impulse to defend infrastructure is a key motivating energizing aspect. What kinds of things that you do could apply when we're talking about physical risk to infrastructure from climate forces? I'd say I'm thinking about my early experiences with NERC and the electricity ISAC, the idea of sharing best practices and warnings ahead of the curve so that you can put yourself in better shape, put your organization in better shape, so that if and when the adversary comes knocking in the OT cyber world, or Mother Nature comes knocking in the physical climate world, you have a better chance of weathering the experience, having resilience, getting knocked around, but still staying on your feet or getting back on your feet sooner. I thought those things apply. The whole idea of what works, sharing best practices. When I was a baby application security guy in a startup in Boston, I remember dialing, and I was going to do some of the marketing and outreach. Somebody must have thought I was extroverted. I remember dialing Ron Ross, who at the time, and maybe still or until recently, was sort of the chief cyber guru at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. He stopped me short when I was starting to tell him what our cool application security tool was going to do in the early 2000s. And he said, "Listen, Andy, I can't really talk to you. I hear what you're saying, but I can't use it. Go out and find somebody that's doing something with your product that's helping them in some demonstrable way. And I'll talk to them, and we'll call that What Works," part of his What Works series. I would say that impulse to find best practices that can be shared, exemplars, organizations that are moving out early, and we know who they are in the OT cyber world, depending on which sector we hone in on. And I can tell you from reading the rate cases and other plans of utilities for climate resilience, some of them are doing some great things that could be emulated to good effect by others. Some of them are just totally not in motion at all for various reasons. And if they did look at what the exemplars are doing, kind of like me saying, you, Dale, you helped that first-time speaker be oriented their first time, there's some things that can help the early movers move faster than they otherwise might have in both domains.
Yeah. I wonder if it ties a little bit into your CCE as well, in the sense that don't put it up now, Liz, but we're going to show this Venn diagram that shows overlap. But then there's a certain amount when you look at consequence reduction measures, the kind of the short version of it that I talk about, or the full-blown version of CCE. Mm-hmm. You're looking for the really bad things that could happen to the system. And those could happen for a variety of reasons, traditional ones, and now increasingly these new ones. Climate isn't new. I would say most impact to critical infrastructure, most of the really serious impacts we've had to critical infrastructure have been weather related. Hurricanes, floods, fires, those have happened for years and years and years. Right. There's a certain increase in frequency and size of those in the last couple of decades. And same with cybersecurity. Cybersecurity increase in at least the attention, if not the impact, in the last couple of decades. So I almost wonder if you've got some intersection between the two, or the nexus between the two could be on this consequence side of the equation. And you introduced me in our back and forth to a term I hadn't heard called critical function assurance.
Sure.
And is that trying to capture that, or what exactly does INL mean when they talk about critical function assurance?
Okay, sure. I'll begin with the consequence prioritization from phase one of CCE, mm-hmm. and then I'll bring it on home. Let's see how it goes with CFA, critical function assurance. I think so much when I'm giving counsel to folks on climate resilience now, which again, it hasn't replaced my cyber world. It's an add-on. It's mm-hmm. another threat vector. I see so much applying from CCE and what we've learned and what we've shared at S4 across the community, not just CCE stuff, right? The idea that breaks pretty simply. You have a certain amount of money, a finite amount of money, and certainly a finite amount of human capability and resource to apply to any given problem. if you're in infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and we do a lot with the DoD too, the most important thing in the world is the mission. Can you continue to reliably perform the mission for which your organization exists? If you are not doing what it takes to keep performing the mission, then you really, what are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
Below the mission, maybe I'm getting to CFA earlier than I thought, is the handful, it could just be one, but it could be half a dozen of functions or processes that are so important to the fulfillment of that mission that were you to lose them for any significant amount of time, it's a mission kill. It's like we would say to some of our early CCE prospective customer partners when we're at the senior level, how would you kill your company? The answer doesn't necessarily appear in that first conversation, but it ultimately, in phase one leading into phase two, is take this function out and we're dead in the water. We're no longer generating electricity. We're no longer purifying water. Our communications are out. So that's critical function assurance. Another way that one of my colleagues who work closely with Michael Asante on CCE puts it is that critical function assurance is a refinement in language from consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering. Sorry about all that in one big swoop. But by not tipping your hat and saying the risks are all cyber early, it opens the aperture and lets you see more broadly. Because really what you're not trying to do a cyber thing, you're trying to do defense of the mission by identifying and then figuring out ways of protecting those most critical functions. Back again, as I said, I was going to touch on consequence prioritization. I just pulled CCE in its 4 phases across the table and said, which parts help with physical climate risks and which parts don't. And I'll just use my own fingertip graphics here. Phase 1, consequence prioritization, means identify what matters most, and that's where you're going to spend your time, most of your time. And that's the same in this other methodology I've been building, or a decision framework called ICAR, Infrastructure, Climate Adaptation and Resilience. Phase 1 is the exact same language. Phase 2, which in CCE world was system of system breakdown, identifying all the people, process, and technology that deliver the functions that support the mission. In the ICAR framework, we start looking at, not looking at particular technologies, but what's coming at us and when. What do the climate models say we should expect is going to be landing on our infrastructure? What types of forces and by approximately when? Phase 3 in CCE is where the targeter gets involved, because we're dealing with a sentient adversary. And if we have a sentient person with targeting experience, they have a good sense after they've gotten to that far of what are the things to aim for to take this function, to take this company or this military mission out. In phase 3 in the ICAR methodology, we're talking about interdependencies. If we lose electricity, are we going to lose water? Are the water utilities that are providing the water to cool a data center that supports an electric utility, are they leaning in on hardening their assets so that the electric utility can keep doing its job? Or will the electric utility fail because of the other partners it's dependent on? They haven't been leaning in with the same level of zeal that they were. Finally, phase 4 is exactly the same again. In CCE and in ICAR, the climate decision support tool methodology, it's about bringing engineering first principles to bear. What can you do to make it so that if and when the cyber adversary comes all the way knocking, has the targeting, has the payload, that they don't achieve the effect that they were trying to achieve, primarily by engineered means. And on the climate side, when the forces of nature hit with a certain level of strength that goes beyond what you had seen historically, that you've built up the defenses, you've created a flood wall, you've built berms around a water utility, you've elevated substation equipment in case of flooding, you've undergrounded distribution lines or treated the poles, you've ballistically hardened the transformers, things like that, so that you'll be stronger than you otherwise would have, and you have to do all those things proactively. That's my not too short answer.
Well, I'm not going to put the audience through a reprise of our interview/debate on CCE and the 4 steps. I'll link to that in the show notes.
Okay.
There's a lot I like and a lot I question about it. And we go over that in our discussion. It's interesting how you think the 4 steps could be combined. To me, though, that the intersection is really on that first step. Whether you call it, whether we look at it from the critical function assurance approach or from step 1 of the CCE. I think where I'm having trouble with it is that, yes, we're trying to make sure we have the critical functions necessary still running. But beyond that identification of those critical functions, it seems to split quite a bit. So yes, I would say there is a nexus at that critical function, but that was always true. And that always will be true, not only of weather, but of any sort of thing that could affect that critical function, whether we're dealing with enhanced weather impacts or likelihoods coming up, or the way they were 30 or 40 years ago. I'm thinking, you remember the gentleman from Florida Power and Light on stage talked about the hurricane that went through Fort Myers in 2022. I should know the name because my parents were right in the middle of it, but I can't remember the name of it. But FPL, none of their transmission towers were affected.
Mm-hmm.
None of their substations were out of commission. They had, I shouldn't say that. There might have been some substation issues, but I know for a fact he said they didn't lose a single transmission tower in a Cat 4 hurricane because that was a critical function assurance method. Criteria that they had is that the wind can't blow these things down.
Sure.
So maybe try to help me a little bit on how someone in our sector, in the OT security community, how beyond circling those same critical function assurance and saying, yeah, we need to worry. Is there anything cyber that could affect this? Is there anything weather that could affect this? I understand that nexus. Should we go to the chart next, or how do you want to try to help me understand that better?
I'm okay. Just maybe to relieve people having to see my face the whole time. Let's go to the chart.
Okay, so this put up the chart, and this I thought was the key slide. This is the one that really wanted me to have you back on the show, because I think there's something here. I'm just not sure what. And Andy, I know the people on the video watching on YouTube are seeing it. We'll include it in the show notes, but maybe describe what you have on the screen, and then maybe tackle one of those things in the intersection.
That's great. And yeah, I won't subject you ad nauseum to each of these pieces in there. Okay. But the idea was basically, all right, if I'm going to try to speak about climate risk, physical climate risk to infrastructure, to the OT security tribe of whom I count myself, I'm going to have to find metaphors and analogies that make sense to them if I'm going to communicate anything. So that was months, Dale, before assembling it. But that was the beginning, was just the impulse of, whenever you're trying to bring a new topic into an audience for which it doesn't have significant background, you're trying to make it relatable by comparing it to things, right? This is pretty pedestrian, but not everybody does this. And it did hurt a little bit to make it happen. So as you can see on this slide, these are terms that go from the left bar, which is your NIST framework terms, the big buckets from identify down to recover, the OT cyber side. And again, this was just a casual exercise. I wasn't rigorous, but I put in some things that I thought OT cyber crew would say, yeah, that threat intel does fit into identify, cyber insurance is part of recover, et cetera. And then I did the same thing on the climate physical side, where I found things that were roughly analogous to the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, slotted them in. And that's what I had at first, was just those two. And then I something said there has to be the middle part. This is where you're making good on your claim that these things are in some way related. And so you can see, and I'll start with and maybe stop with just the top line, that when we're being in our futurist
Andy, hold on just a second. For those listening, you can envision two ovals or 2 circles, one OT cyber and one climate physical, with a various set of elements on them. And then there's an overlap or intersection in the center that has, I'm counting here, that has 5 different elements that are common to the two. And Andy's about to describe one of those elements.
Yeah, and that's right. So the first line under identify from the NIST framework for the OT cyber folks, it has threat intel. How do you put your mind out into the future to get a sense for what's coming at you, so that you can prepare in advance and not be caught flat-footed? On the far right-hand side, in the climate physical side, circle of the diagram, it says downscaled climate models. And I'll say what that is in a second. And down the middle, where it says in common, it says functions and assets by consequence. Going back to the conversation we just had about CCE and about, in the spirit of reducing the risk, the classic risk management equation, where you spend on the cyber side, or at least a lot of people do, trying to calculate likelihood. And when they ultimately come up with that likelihood equation, they don't have that much confidence in it because they don't really know how secure they are. They don't really know what the adversary is going to do either. So my CCE and INL brethren, they educated me and got me thinking, when we're talking about national security and critical infrastructure security, don't worry about likelihood. Likelihood is going to be 1. That thing is coming. We don't know exactly when, but it is coming. And so put all of the wood behind the arrow onto the impact, or we say consequence as well. Threat intel on OT cyber. You can subscribe to various threat intel firms. You can buy tools that may help you get an early warning glimpse at what's coming. You can evaluate threat by looking at your own vulnerabilities and the CVEs and that product that you just bought and deployed widely. Is it full of high severity vulnerabilities that everybody knows about that could be exploited, or 0 days? Pretty soon we'll have S-bombs more widely deployed, widely available, that can help people. On the climate physical side, when you're trying to be a futurist, nobody knows the future. But a lot of people are interested in it. The credit ratings firms, the insurance companies, the investors, property owners and managers, businesses themselves, all the way down to the individual homeowner. They want to know what's coming as much as they can. And so we look to 6 different national labs. INL is not one of them. NOAA and NCAR in Boulder, and others in European and other parts of the world, that are using these gigantic models on supercomputers that help folks get an understanding that in this part of the world, downscaled means reduced down to a smaller plot. The smallest you'll typically hear about will be 4 square kilometers, that I've heard both from colleagues at Argonne Lab in Chicago and from Lawrence Livermore National Lab in California. 4 square kilometers is not that big a space. So you could imagine, okay, they're telling me that it's a high flood risk by 2032. It's a high wildfire risk, probably now in the California example, and how much more intense it's going to get. The whole reason you want to be able to predict the future, I guess if you're gambling, is so you can make some money. And sometimes that is the stock market, but in infrastructure protection, so you can know where to spend those protection dollars first so that they'll have the biggest effect, provide the biggest resilience benefit. That's the first line. I won't do that for all 6 of them.
This is a little bit off topic, but as you're talking about the, down to 4 square kilometers and the precision they're trying to create these estimates or analysis, this threat intel, as you called it.
Yeah. Where
do you think we have better, quote, threat intel today, in climate or cyber, OT cyber?
That's crazy. I would say that you are as well versed on the former topic, some combination of you and Ralph and the other folks in the.
I'd actually say Rob Lee and the guys that look at it all the time. I don't see as much information as they do, but I'm just curious. Yeah. I mean, I will tell you, I'll give you a little bit of think. I almost think we have more on climate.
Climate is based on science, right? It's
yeah.
Physics, it's chemistry, it's meteorology. It's a lot of things that we know a lot about. Some of them their interactions are so complex that we have to apply supercomputers and big brains too to get a decent glimpse of them. But I would say, yeah, after pushing off and saying, yeah, you probably, because you interview Rob Lee and know these guys on a regular basis, you probably understand the state of the art there. But the climate stuff is knowable. The only thing that gives people pause is that, and it should be the same way in the cyber side, is that it hasn't happened yet. Let me do a quick blurb on what's called backcasting. Why should anyone have any confidence that the climate models are, the projections that they're giving are accurate and therefore helpful? One way that they test them, and they've been doing this a long time, is to go back in time, look at what a climate model from one of those labs, which back then would have been really comparatively primitive back in the year 2000 and running on slower machines too, vastly slower, right? Is to look at what they projected for the year 2020. Were they in the ballpark for temperature in a certain region? Were they in the ballpark for precipitation events that came from that increased temperature? Other types of events that are secondary or tertiary events? Or were they wildly off? And what's happened is, by looking at those historical projections, and not just 2020, but all the time, coming up into the present that we've observed, we've found that, damn, they're pretty good. They're by and large very close. And if you take several of them and overlay them and make a consensus model, now you can have pretty high confidence that those things were doing a good job in the year 2000. And if they've gotten better and they're on faster computers, they have more data in 2023, odds are, also always allowing for uncertainty, they're probably pretty good. In fact, they are the best thing that we have. There's a couple of people that take issue with that, and that would be a whole different episode. I would for a different audience, probably, I'd like to talk about. But for most companies, though, especially the ones that are only using deep historical data to tell them about, we said probability earlier, the probability of a 500-year flood or a 1,000-year drought, things aren't really relevant anymore after Houston had 3 500-year floods in 3 concurrent years a few years ago. The climate models are the best thing that we have for getting ourselves oriented and having threat intel for physical climate risk.
Yeah, I don't know if, I think sometimes we may believe there's more precision in those models. Not the scientists think that, but the general public might think that there's more precision, that we know what's going to happen. It's extremely complex. It's almost though more of a, my saying the climate is almost more of a realizing how little precision we have on the OT cyber threat intel, of knowing what's going to happen next on that side. I don't think it's even close. I think we have much more precision on the climate side.
Hey, we're not here to, make the OT cyber people, feel bad or doubt themselves, but that could be an unintentional product of this talk.
It's more of, we have a lot of work to do. Yeah. I mean, you have to admit where you are and what you know to make progress. I have a whole keynote coming up on that in Singapore. So I've been thinking a lot about that. As you know, what happens a lot, this actually happened recently on a healthcare podcast episode I did. I learn on these podcasts. And so listening to you, I'm having a little trouble finding the nexus in terms of, I think it's at that top, at that, I got to look at your term again, critical function assurance. But I do see a nexus in maybe learning from each other. Mm-hmm. So for example, you broke down the 4 steps. I would think that the OT security community could look at how the climate folks, I don't know what the proper term is, the people are trying to address climate change and understand it, mitigation and adaptation, how they are addressing that in those 4 steps. And we might be able to learn something, maybe not directly transferable, but say, what is the equivalent of what they're trying to do at this step that we haven't thought of yet on this step? And I think there might be some real good cross-learning opportunities.
I think I have something for you. You be the judge, of course. And that is when we move away from legacy is what's deployed in both of those worlds. It's often the same stuff, right? And it's what works. It's what's running now. Mm-hmm. When we think about what we're going to build next and how we can make it better than the legacy that we find so much fault in. On the OT side, the OT cyber side, there are initiatives like Ginger Wright, who's the PM for cyber-informed engineering, Sarah Flukes over in Germany, making very, very similar engineer out the cyber risk sounds, the whole secure by design or resilient by design movement, which means, to me is like, learn what you don't like about legacy. And when you design and then build and then deploy and operate the next generation, do it that way so that the risk profile is greatly reduced. On the physical side, the physical climate side, I don't know if I shared this with you or not, or the audience, but in 2022 in the summer, 3 data centers shut down, 2 of them in London when it hit 40 degrees Celsius, and 1 in California, and a bunch of others I know about that aren't in the press. The reason they were shut down is, this is all legacy stuff, right? Built stuff that's built and operating. The reason they shut down is they weren't designed for the temperatures that they experienced.
Mm-hmm.
They were designed based on historical patterns, and don't worry, it'll never be 104 degrees Fahrenheit in London. And yet it was, and it persisted long enough that it was Google and Salesforce, I think, were the 2 companies that said, rather than fry our servers and cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, we're going to do an outage and hopefully it'll fail over well. The takeaway from that, and we'll have to see if it ricochets back to OT cyber, is that none of the critical infrastructure systems that we have in energy, in water, in communications, transportation, manufacturing, were designed for what we're seeing in 2023. And if they're not designed to handle what we see in 2023, they damn sure aren't going to be able to operate successfully in the coming years, because it is going to get worse. Maybe that's a difference from the cyber world. It's hard to know whether offense is going to outstrip defense more than it does now. If it does, whether defense will have a big comeback. But we do know that on the threat side, the climate part is going to get worse year upon year, and we need to redo our codes and standards for buildings and all those other things that we build, the ASHRAE standards for HVAC, to be able to operate successfully at temperatures that those companies that operate them and the customers that depend on them have never seen before.
Yeah, the common thread there would be rethink your assumptions based on the new environment, right? So you're talking about 40 degrees Celsius might not be enough to think about. From the climate side, on our side, on the OT cybersecurity side, it could be soft interlocks and PLCs preventing bad things from happening.
Yeah.
Yes, and this is very common. You'll go in and you'll talk to an engineer. You'll say, what's really bad that could happen? They'll say this. And I say, how do you stop it? They'll say, the PLC will stop it. If it sees this, it will stop it. But they haven't dealt with the new world. What if someone reprograms that PLC?
Yeah.
And so I think we could probably find some of these and a little bit of cross-pollination between the two. Who knows? Maybe we can help them out a little bit as well. I kind of like that idea. I have 2 other things. I'll let you comment. First, I'll let you comment on that if you want to. Then I have 2 more things.
Okay. Thank you, Dale. Both of these worlds are abstract and pretty esoteric when it comes down to the man on the street or the generalist or the man and woman on the hill too. It takes a lot of knowledge to be able to understand and then do something useful in either of these 2 spaces. But because in CCE and the climate version of it, ICAR, both end in phase 4 engineered protections that help you be resilient, help you survive and keep operating. The engineering standard of care, to bring the lawyers into the mix, the engineering standard of care says, if we just use a building as an example, you're going to build this commercial building according to the codes and standards that apply in that particular state. Sometimes it's more local, but it's in the United States, it's down to a typical state level. Other countries have their versions of these things. And so the standard of care means you will do that. If you're found to have not at least built to that floor, then you could lose your license and you could cost your company many millions of dollars in legal fees if found guilty of violating that. But there's a second piece to the engineering standard of care, and that is you're supposed to, as a licensed engineer, have common sense and experience, and bring that to the table as well when you're doing your design and the architecture level, all the way through the construction partners that sign up to that design. In both of those two worlds, we're still in the very early days. Like, how would a judge know, and maybe you've brought people on that can go in depth on this, that the cybersecurity protections or the design of a manufacturing plant was sufficiently robust that even though it had a substantial material outage from a cyber attack, that they did all the right things that a prudent engineer would have done. This is a cyber engineer, right? A OT cyber engineer. And so that they're well defended against that lawsuit. Similarly, on the physical part, the engineering standard of care says they should have, at some point, they should have seen that the weather was changing, the extreme weather patterns were starting to become more common and more intense. They should have built that safety factor. Maybe that term can cross a little bit over here. They should have built in a safety factor, so it's not just guaranteeing proper functioning on a blue sky day, but we can see the black sky day coming. We know about how serious it's going to be, and we should have engineered reliable operations to handle that event too, or at least handle it better than otherwise.
Yeah. So I think there's two things there. The one is the crossover, which I'd encourage you, if you're writing a book, you should look at that. That backcasting was a good example that could cross over between the two. The other topic you talk about, that gets real interesting. I've talked a lot with professional engineers and others, and it's hard to get them on the record or consensus, but the feeling, the general state is something bad happens. It's investigated. A new practice is put in place so that bad thing doesn't happen again. And then you get to where you're talking about, where it becomes legal. It's rarely in advance that such a thing becomes required for engineers and a standard of due care. It almost always has to be in response to something happening, lessons learned and such, which nobody likes, but there's a long history of that. If you look at the Cassandra's book that Richard Clark put out, there's a whole section on the mining. There's a section on Joe Weiss for our audience, but there's also a section on the mining regulations and standards and such. And it was always this really bad thing happened, this catastrophe, and then it got better. This catastrophe, then it got better. I think when you get into the legal, it's hard to avoid that sort of thing as much as we would like to be proactive.
I think it's humans, right? It's just the way we are. As much as we preach proactivity and being intelligent and being out in front of the problem, sometimes you got to feel the pain. The community has to feel the pain in order to be able to make the business case that you were trying to make earlier, but you didn't have the shared horrible experience that allowed people to nod their heads and say, yeah, we'll put an extra $10 million in, even though I don't think that thing's going to happen, but just to be safe, let's do it.
Or not have a choice, as the engineer at a certain point doesn't have a choice.
When it's built in. When it's built in. Some of our CCE partners say that when some of these concepts, and it doesn't have to be CCE exactly, but when some of these concepts become widely known and accepted, and they're baked into the standards, the engineering standards, then the people that design and build those things, it won't be discretionary anymore. There won't be any argument about it. They'll just do it that way, down to your statement about PLCs handling it or not. It'll just be the way. It's like when a best practice becomes carved in a tablet. Now forever, that's the way we're going to do things until we learn something else. Yeah.
So let's hit two other things quickly here. Maybe quickly, they're not easy ones. You mentioned at the very start that we're in a budget constrained world, right? It just, every company is this way. They have a certain amount of money to spend on risk, for example. Now they can spend more than that, but then it starts to, they either have to charge their customers more, rate increases, product pricing increases, or take reduced profits. So we're in a real world where money is a real thing. Time and money has to be allocated.
For sure.
And we look at climate and we look at OT cybersecurity. And I must tell you, this is something that I've really struggled with, is when you look at the impact of weather events over many, many decades, but especially the last 2 decades,
Right.
versus the impact of over OT cyber incidents affecting OT or operations, it's hard to argue that we shouldn't be spending 1,000 to 1 or 1,000,000 to 1 on addressing climate risk. How how do we not get lost in this game? How do you make the case for OT spending money to address OT cyber risk when the impact based on climate is already so much greater?
Great question, Dale. First of all, I don't want my answer to alienate myself from all of the folks that are part of the OT cyber community. And that's not just the end users, but it's the people that dream up, make, market, and sell
Yeah.
the products that help them too. So I'm definitely not going to, and not just in my own self-preservation interest. I don't believe that we should skew radically one way or another. That will always be wrong, but we'll try to be less wrong as we decide how much defensive or protective funding. And there's other hazards too, right? There, we're not
Right.
going to even say them.
I mean, supply chain,
Of course,
workforce. I think a lot of times in our community, especially, and it's very natural. It's not unique to this community.
yeah.
You're so focused on this one thing that you don't realize the executives are dealing with a wide range of issues. And
Oh, that
this is
sounds like
just
the
one of
invisible
many.
gorilla from the presentation, right? You're flying,
Exactly.
and it's good to be focused. Otherwise, you're a space shot. But sometimes there's a cost to that focus, which is the thing here and the thing here. And if they're coming at you and you're not noticing, that's a problem.
Mhm.
There is a podcast just put out. I don't know if have you ever met Llewellyn King? Do
Oh,
you know
yeah.
who Llewellyn is?
Yeah.
So I was on a CCE oriented one with him a few months ago, and now I like pay attention to him a certain amount. It's very interesting. He was talking about Maui and the fires that had happened there recently on the west side of the island. He said he interviewed some utility CEOs, and I don't think he just meant HECO. He was casting his net more broadly, and this was including before the most recent fires, and said, or he pulled out a statement from them that said they're starting to think that the climate risks, the physical climate risks, may be larger than the cyber risks that they, depending on who they are, recently woke up to as well. Now they're trying to figure out, to your point, to everybody's point about finite reserves, finite resources, where should they get the biggest resilience bang for the buck as they do this. One quick point on this, because I intone the word resilience. If our culture, if our country, our culture, our companies could decide that resilience is worth a hell of a lot, that even though it feels like money being spent on nothing when the skies are blue and everything's operating at peak efficiency, that there is a real value. Maybe it has to be rewarded by the insurance companies. Maybe there does have to be a financial payback. But if resilience could be calculated and felt more in the boardroom, in Washington, D.C., and state departments, state houses, I think that there would be a larger pool of funding to pull from, so that people could put more into cyber than they do now when they need more into physical climate stuff, and whatever the other, wide net of risks are facing a particular industry. I don't think we value resilience very much at all in this country.
Well, there's a lot of threads to pull on that one that I'm going to avoid because we'd be here another hour.
Sure.
And the Maui thing still strikes us a little close living here in Maui. So I don't want to get down that rabbit hole either. I do want to finish up though, where you finished up your session. And I thought it was an interesting close. Again, you followed instructions. You had a good call for action at the end of your big idea. So I liked it. You said at the end of the session, you weren't asking for the OT cybersecurity community to change their mission. Rather, you were asking the audience to put on an additional hat. What do you mean? When we put on, if those of us in the OT security community put on a different hat or an additional hat, and let's say a climate hat, what does that look like? What does that mean?
I think going back to the beginning, it's appreciating that at center, you're a defender of infrastructure. That's why you're doing these things. You're doing it for money too, in most cases, but you're trying to have an impact, and that is to defend infrastructure, which undergirds civilization, whether it's at your town, the state, your country, the world, whatever level you're at. Driven by that imperative, if you know that that's your mission, that I think wearing multiple hats is an awkward metaphor. When you try it, something invariably falls off. Let's go back to what we just said with the blindered view of a couple minutes ago. All I was asking the audience then and now too would be, if you're focused on a particular sub part of the OT cyber challenge, or maybe you're a more senior level executive and you do look broadly and don't go quite as deep, but still you're on that topic, right? Is to just every once in a while, maybe you can't lose these blinders that keep you focused completely, but every once in a while, open them up and take a look to the left and the right, and become more what we would call, at least a little bit, an all hazards type of defender. Because cybersecurity is super critical today. It was yesterday and it will be tomorrow. But guess what? Guess what else is coming in terms of AI and ML and things that we have a really hard time predicting. That may swamp in some ways the types of threats that we worry about today in cyber. And if you're not at least paying some attention to what's happening with GPT-4 and some of the other generative things, you don't want to be caught flat-footed at that. Flat-footed on that. Maybe an editor can help. Similarly with the climate stuff, if you're so focused on just your topic and it doesn't allow you to see to the left or to the right, you're going to get smacked, and your customers, their community that you care about, you're not going to be doing them good service. So I guess open the aperture is the metaphor to leave it with. Look a little more broadly, if not all the time, then at least take the time to do it occasionally so you're not surprised.
Well, that's great. Andy, I appreciate you being on the show. I appreciate you helping me understand this a little bit better. I think you're onto something here. I think you're still in the early innings, but I think there's something there. I certainly learned a few things I'm going to take away from this and try going forward and give even more thought. So I'd encourage you to keep down this path. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, where are you most active? Are you a LinkedIn guy, Twitter person? Where do you hang out these days?
We'll see how this mirrors the audience. Was very active on LinkedIn and still there, but I'm getting a little bit silly there. Sorry, on Twitter. Maybe I'm mimicking the behavior of the founder. So LinkedIn is where more serious conversations are happening. And one other flyer for the audience is I am underway doing interviews for a second book that around the framework of critical function assurance looks at 4 threats: cyber, AI, those are the digital ones, and then physical climate and kinetic, or lessons from Ukraine, how to design, build, and operate a grid under bombardment. So I'm doing 30-minute interviews for that. And there's a bunch of people in your world, in the S4 digital bond, unsolicited response world, that I think could make an impression that might survive the interview and get into the book. So please contact me if you'd like to go through that process.